3 maids in 3 days. 3 folded uniforms on a chair by the back stair. A trail of small, hurried suitcases. Faces that said, without words, "I will not stay." The mansion kept their exits like a ledger. Names struck, spots vacant. It was winter in the city, but inside the house the temperature was different. A clear, measured cold that had nothing to do with weather. It came from the man who ruled it. The bell at 7, precise and indifferent, sounded like a punctuation mark that day. A young woman paused on the threshold, hand raised over the brass, feeling the cool. She did not look like the incoming storm. She wore a faded apron over a dress that had been sewn and replaced in places with thread of different colors. Her hair was pulled back with the kind of practical skill that made any comb unnecessary. In her palm, a folded photograph, frayed at the edges. A woman in a thin hospital gown, sleeping with an oxygen line taped to her cheek. A handwritten note tucked behind the photo read, in a cramped script, "Medicine this week." The paper had a small coffee stain at the corner. Dandara stood for a slow breath and then stepped inside. The staff watched as the new hire crossed the marble hall. The mansion was a cathedral of polished surfaces and orchestrated silence. Chandeliers refracted light into quiet verdicts. Carpets swallowed footsteps. Portraits watched with the indulgence inherited from generations that had never had to fight for a bus ticket or a hospital bill. In that house, labor was performed like an unpaid ritual. In that house, those who failed were shown the door as if failure were a contagion. Henrique Costa sat where he had been placed since the accident. Inside a nest of cushions, his body a map of broken appointments. The accident was a seam everyone knew to avoid ripping open. He had been a man who moved like a metronome. Decisive, efficient, a presence that occupied rooms. Now he was a machine of appointments and disdain. He ruled the household through instructions and a ledger of grievances. People said the accident had stolen more than his muscles, it had stolen his tolerance. He watched Dandara enter with the same patient attention he might afford an insect. He wore a suit even at home. The cut was immaculate. His eyes, the only part of him that moved regularly, measured things that were visible and things that were not. He flicked a hand once and the house responded. A staff member nearby bowed her head and approached with a list. "You've been warned," she translated for those who listened. "He breaks people." Her lips made the motion, but the words were for whoever would listen. Christina smiled at the wall. She had been with them long enough to wear loyalty like a second skin. She liked the way other people failed. It made her achievements look like deliberate art. Donna Gloria, the head housekeeper, watched with a tired surveillance. She had been present when Enrique had been patient and when he had gone still. Her eyes were warm, but her hands were calloused from a decade of smoothing out the consequences of the men's cruelties. Dandara's first day began at a pace meant to displace. Henrique produced a list that might have been written precisely to humiliate. Clean the underside of the grand piano. Remove all dust from the silk curtains without pulling at their hem. Iron shirts not yet bought. Arrange the lilies in the foyer according to an obsession with symmetry. The demands were surgical. The undertone loud and public. Stay and be broken in front of us. She accepted the list without flinching. She had accepted long lines of indignity before. Each one was a small currency to be exchanged for whatever would keep her mother alive a few more weeks. She folded the list into the pocket of her apron, the way people fold hope into pockets. She went to the piano and set her palm against the lacquered curve, feeling for the grain beneath, and then she worked. For a while, she simply worked. The staff watched and took bets. Christina's bets were always for the house. 3 days, she said under her breath. If she makes it 3 days, I'll eat my gloves. The impossible tasks did their work in the usual arc. At noon, Henrique summoned the household to his strictness. He delivered corrections with the kind of precision reserved for machine parts. Not there, there. A finger traced a straight line that told people everything about how far he had traveled from pity. Dandara did not argue. When he called for silence, she nodded and continued. When he gave instructions, she met his gaze with an evenness that unseated some of the certainty in the room. She did not lower her eyes. If she refused to be humiliated, she did so without loudness. It was a dignity of refusal, small and steady, like breath measured against a storm window. Between tasks, she left small marks of her life. She would return to the back stair at dusk and practice in a room where the staff left behind discarded chairs. She removed her shoes and placed her feet on the worn wooden floor. Music was for the living, and Dandara interpreted music as weight on the soles of her feet. She would press her heels and toes against the boards and feel the vibration of the city through the building's bones. The rhythm found her not through ears, but through the floor and the hum in the walls and the tiny, incidental bass line of passing traffic. She moved like somebody rehearsing secrets. Her fingers traced chords in the air. A neighbor's radio thumped downstairs. It was enough for her body. Henrique found reasons to stay in his corner and watch. From time to time, he would lift the hand that still worked, the one not given to paralysis, and tap the armrest like a metronome. He had not moved like that for a long time. When he was younger, he had danced like a man who trusted his limbs to do what they promised. Now, his gestures were careful, precise instructions to a life that no longer obeyed him. Seeing Dandara move made something loosen somewhere under his breastbone, a memory, perhaps, of the way his own feet used to find the world. There was a photograph on the side table beside his chair. In it, he and a woman were caught in a winter light, laughing at something only they understood. He kept it turned so only he could read the caption written on the back. The picture smelled like a man's idea of remembrance. He seldom allowed it to be seen, as if it might be contagious. Dandara cleaned the piano's underside as requested, using an improvised hook to reach the shadowed places. When she finished, she polished the keys until they reflected her own face in a manner that pleased her. Christina, who liked to perform indignation, went to Enrique and, loud and triumphant in the way of small people, the details of the day. "He asked for the underside of the piano," she said. "She did it. Did you see? I said she'd be gone by lunch." Henrique watched the house file out. He felt a sting that was new in its shape. He wondered at the quiet with which she practiced in the empty rooms. He thought, briefly and with less generosity than he might have had before, that this would be another thing to own, a new person on whom his rules could be calibrated. That night, Dandara walked home with the pockets of her apron heavier with coins. Still, there was a note reminding her of the medicine. In the small apartment she shared with her mother, the light was thin and everything lined up like a patient's promises. Her mother had a cough that sounded like small stones grinding. Dandara smoothed a blanket over her mother's thin shoulders and kissed the forehead that had once sewn her dresses. Her mother's lips tried to form words. She could not always make them clear. Dandara sat, fingers pressed against the older woman's wrist, feeling the pulse like a drummer. Later, she sat by the window and wrote out a list: medicine, rent, bus fare. She folded the list and tucked it beneath the photograph of the hospital bed. Sometimes, writing was a ritual that made fear legible. She signed a few motions to herself, small, private gestures that read like rehearsed language. Early the next morning, someone on the staff placed a wrapped dress in her trunk. Dona Helena had intervened simply by deciding she would. The lady of the house, who still read the world in the currency of soft power, had noticed the way Dandara moved. She had watched her in the doorway one afternoon, a quiet spectator to something she had not felt in years, the sense that life could be changed by a pair of feet that would not be cowed. She liked gestures that had content. Donna Helena's involvement had the weight of many years of diplomacy. She did not overtly challenge Henrique often. She managed his world by shaping the world around him. That morning, she found Henrique irritated by a small imperfection in his coffee and announced, without using the word, that she would do something about the household's morale. She called for a benefit, a modest event to raise money for a local clinic. Her idea was not sentiment. It was a calculated bid to do something public that would be difficult for Henrique to refuse. It was also the sort of thing that let her place people within the household she favored. When the dress arrived, Dandara opened the package with a slow reverence. It was not a gown that would blind a room, but it was honest in its cut, a dress that moved with a body that knew how to bend. On the label, in handwriting that Dandara did not know and would not later forget, there was a short note: "Wear this with your head up." The note was unsigned, and that was part of the grace. Word spread, as it does when houses are small and their dramas fit easily into the mouths of many. The benefit became a rumor that moved through the staff like a change in the weather. When Donna Gloria mentioned the event, the word perform came out of her mouth as if it were a simple obligation. For Dandara, perform meant everything and nothing. She had danced in private because she could not afford what it would cost to be seen. To perform in the house would expose her to the one person she had been taught to avoid, Henrique. He had, in the days that followed, increased his tests. He set tasks that seemed intentionally designed to fail, to make her small in front of the others. Bring him a particular old book from the upstairs study and return before the hour, if the clock were to strike. Arrange the cutlery she had never seen in a pattern his forebears would have approved. Clean a portrait's frame without the frame's hiree noticing. It was as if he had collected ways to embarrass people and then chosen them like instruments. The staff felt the atmosphere change. For Christina, the house had become a theater where judgment was performed and deserved. For Donna Gloria, there was friction between survival and the ethic of care. Dandara met each demand with the economy of someone who had negotiated with need her entire life. She had a method for endurance. The day became a series of small economies. She would save her breath to do something that mattered and spend it very carefully on the rest. She learned the mansion's architecture with the accuracy of a cartographer. Where the staff left dirt, she found a pattern. Where they left time, she found an interval to practice. At night, she found the ballroom. It was a cavern of light and mirrors, a room intended for the kind of gala that never came now. It had once been a place where Henrique might have danced. The chandeliers hung like instruments out of place, but they still collected light as if it were asking to be noticed. She would stand barefoot and press her feet to the floor. The room did not offer music. She created it with footfalls and breath. She would clap, she would stamp. She would run fingertips across the smooth banister and allow the vibration to pass through her bones. In that isolated rhythm, she found a language the mansion had not provided her, a way to translate the world into movement. One evening, while she practiced a sequence of turns, Henrique's chair was wheeled into the doorway without announcement. He had begun to test the world from his reduced theater of control and had discovered that watching was sometimes less expensive than intervening. When Dandara felt the presence, she did not stop. She let the movement carry her through the room and toward a place that belonged to nobody's memory but her own. He sat erect and composed and watched. There was a tenderness to his gaze that frightened him. He suspected he was the last person to allow himself pity, and the discovery made him angry. Yet something in the way Dandara used the floor, the way she met the rhythm through her soles and shoulders, released a thin ribbon of something inside him that had been reduced to tension and shame. He saw his own past there, a quick step in a courtyard, a laugh that bent the air. Over the next days, small exchanges began to appear between them, almost as if they were testing the limits of what silence can hold. When Dandara left a note on his table, a short, carefully written slip that read, "Where should I place the lace trim?" Henrique could have dismissed it with a wave. Instead, he tapped a finger twice on the armrest, and someone brought him a slate and pen. He wrote something that was not merely a command. It was a small question about symmetry that betrayed a taste for order, but also the awkwardness of a man attempting dialogue with hands that once would have guided rather than requested. A pattern emerged. She left notes. He returned them with tiny corrections, equally precise. These notes became the parody of communication in a house where sound had lost its authority. They built a grammar of small civilities. Henrique began to find reasons to watch the way her shoulders measured a room, to see the economy in the movements she made, with the quiet steadiness of someone who had rehearsed survival into art. Not all observed this with sympathetic eyes. Christina, who delighted in the spectacle of human collapse, whispered about Dandara's nerve. "She smiles too much," she muttered. "She has the look of someone who believes she will not be broken. People like that always pay for their arrogance." Dona Gloria, older and with softer hands, moved through the household like a slow, sensible rumor. She saw usefulness in Dandara. She noticed how the staff's work flowed smoother when Dandara touched it. Small things were better when her fingers passed over them. When Dona Gloria watched her at the sink, the old woman's tired face would sometimes soften into something like hope. She remembered, without necessarily wanting to, what it was to be the wronged daughter of a broken family and still find a place to stand. The house, which had been built to flatten poverty into service, was changing minutely, like a ship that tilts its compass a degree and, over a long coast, finds itself in different seas. It was the tiny increments that made life meaningful. Outside the house, the city moved like it always did. There were markets and subways and people with furrowed faces who fought for time in a world that rewarded speed. Dandara's mother lay awake sometimes, listening to a cough that measured the hours. The medicine was purchased in small installments. Dandara worked 2 shifts one week to make up for it. Her hands, once bruised by pushing carts and wiping marks from silver, gained the particular grace of someone who had to make speed beautiful. Henrique's world contracted into a circle of mirrors and appointments, but cracks appeared. He would find himself tracing the edge of the piano with his fingers, imagining the sensation of hitting a bar of music and being answered by the body itself. When staff members came to report, they found him less vigilant, as if a part of him had been distracted by a possible memory. He would ask about the past in questions that meant none of his old generosity. During a late afternoon, Dona Helena stopped by the ballroom without announcing her arrival. Her presence was a small, decisive wave. She watched Dandara move and then moved closer. In her hands, she carried a program, a sheet that proposed something public and unavoidable. A benefit, a modest evening to raise funds for a clinic serving the underprivileged. She proposed it not as charity but as a public act. Henrique, who valued public gestures when they fit his image, could call it his and thus be persuaded to participate. She wanted, specifically, someone from the house to perform. It would be an internal gesture, an advertisement of talent raised from the margins into the light. Dandara was surprised when Dona Helena approached her at the servant's side table and laid a hand, maternal but firm, on her arm. Dona Helena's fingers were cool. She met Dandara's eyes, not looking past them, and said nothing that required sound. She mouthed the word "perform," and then, because she knew not everyone in the household would be fluent in silence, she produced a written card and slid it gently into Dandara's hands. "Will you?" the card asked. Dandara looked at the card and then at the woman on the couch with the patient breath. The decision did not belong to Dandara alone. It contained other people's lives, a mother's medicine, a ledger that must be balanced, the open mouth of the rent collector. She felt the room tilt on a new axis. To say yes might mean exposure, humiliation, and the risk of losing everything. To say no would be to keep a secret life secret and perhaps allow her mother's cough to grow louder. She thought of the ballroom and the way the light refracted on the floorboards the day she had danced there. The memory was a tiny defiance. She folded the card into her palm and considered the cost. The staff watched. Christina's lips formed a thin, contemptuous line. Donna Gloria's face offered the smallest, almost imperceptible encouragement. Dandara felt something like a plank below her feet, uncertain but steady enough. She nodded once. It was a small, private motion that said yes without drama. In the language she used most naturally, she signed a simple shape with her hand, an invitation to see her through the movement, and then she wrote on a scrap of paper, "I will try." She left the slip on the kitchen table where everyone could find it. The household buzzed. Rumors braided themselves into a plan. Dresses were discussed. A rehearsal schedule was made. A place was penciled into the social calendar. For the first time since the accident, Henrique was asked, in public, to answer the world rather than command it. Donna Helena knew him well. She knew that pride is often the key to unlocking accountability. If Henrique gave the house something public, people might remember what he had been, and he might in turn have to converse with his own name. When she told him, not as a request but as an item in an itinerary, Henrique listened. He did not speak. He drummed his fingers on the armrest. He thought about the photographs he kept and the memory of a woman who laughed and had once been patient with him. He thought about control. Donna Helena described the benefit as a civic gesture, the sort that might get his name in a column and remind the city of his generosity. It was, she suggested, both good for the community and good for his image. She did not ask. She made the arrangement as if it had always existed. Henrique allowed it. He assigned the task of nurturing the household's contribution to Donna Helena's smile and his own capacity to avoid generosity. He consented, for reasons he barely understood, to the idea of seeing the performance. He did not intend to be moved. He intended to measure. After the conversation, Dandara returned to the ballroom and danced until the lamps dimmed. She practiced until her feet ached and until the vibration of the floor felt as intimate as a heartbeat. She made notes for herself. Turn at the third beat. Extend the right hand like opening something fragile. Pause on the line of light from the chandelier. She practiced in a way that resisted being perfect and instead sought something honest. Henrique watched her from his chair in the doorway that evening and touched the photograph beside him as if testing whether the image was still glued to the past. The presence of the woman who moved in the ballroom introduced an uncertainty into his life that felt dangerous and also, in some odd way, necessary. He felt a small, intrusive warmth that he could not justify. He felt exposed to himself. Outside, the city continued to move. Inside, certain things had been set into motion that did not belong to the man who preferred to order the world rather than be changed by it. A dress was in the making. A benefit was on the books. A young woman had promised to try. The mansion, which had been a sealed clock, began to admit the idea that time might be punctuated by public acts rather than private defenses. And so, with the chessboard set and the players arranged, Dandara returned to her small room and took up the photograph of her mother. She pressed her forehead to the image and then began to rehearse in earnest, fingers finding rhythms on the edge of a chair, feet counting beats on an old floor. The stakes were modest and immense at once. Medicine for a week, rent for a month, the possibility of some recognition that might ricochet beyond the house's walls. The staff made their calculations. Christina continued to watch, waiting for a failure she believed was inevitable. Donna Gloria, quieter now, kept her small kindnesses as if she were guarding a fragile plant. Donna Helena, her diplomacy like a well-tailored suit, had set a public moment in motion. Henrique, who had rejected the touch of vulnerability like an insult, measured the days until the benefit as a man who stocks his shelves with small anxieties. In the hush before the event, there was a quieter wager being placed, not in the staff room, but in the space where two people's lives overlapped without applause. Dandara learned the house. Henrique learned to notice. The thinness of that overlap would become the test of the story. Whether a shuttered life could open to the world with a single touch, or whether it would remain tightly booked behind velvet curtains. The next morning, a messenger arrived with a program stamped in gold. Dandara received it like an ordination. She felt the weight of the paper as if someone had just placed a small key in her palm. She traced her thumb along the type and then tucked the program into her apron pocket, next to the list of bills. She left the folded paper there like a promise and went back to her tasks, moving through the household as if each sweep of a cloth might be a step towards something larger. The house, which had been a repository of rules and quiet cruelties, had become the theater of a wager. That wager would ask everything from a deaf woman and from a man who had once believed that nothing could be asked of him but compliance. It would ask the house to witness, publicly, a moment it had previously insisted on hiding. Neither the winners nor the losses had been measured yet. The day's work settled into a rhythm. The staff kept their corners. Dandara kept her feet warm with the memory of the ballroom. Henrique kept his fingers moving on the armrest as if to a beat only he knew. When the doors closed that night and the mansion inhaled the darkness like a creature waiting, the small notes on the kitchen table lay like seeds, a plan, a talent, a need. Outside, the city breathed, indifferent and immense. Inside, two lives were moving toward an inevitable collision, a touch that had not yet been given and a hand that had been long denied the soft language of another's palm. If anything would change in that house, it would begin at the fingertips. If anything would change in that house, it would begin at the fingertips. If you believe small acts can change lives, subscribe for stories like this. The days that followed folded themselves into a rehearsal of small violences and quieter hopes. The house prepared for the benefit as if for a public ceremony, polishing silver as if it could rub away the past. Guests were invited. Programs were printed. The staff rehearsed their lines for the serving shifts. In the wings of the mansion, in rooms never meant for use by people whose lives overflowed with urgency, Dandara rehearsed until the skin of her feet knew every seam in the floorboards. She practiced with a kind of economy that had been sharpened by necessity. When she turned, she imagined the light catching her hand. When she extended an arm, she thought of the gesture as both a way of saying hello and an offering. She taught herself to keep the expression on her face light, not because the feeling was light, but because she knew how looking like you could withstand a crowd made the crowd kinder. She wrote notes in the margins of an old program. Third beat, lift ribs, hold eyes on one person, smile as if you own the room. Sometimes she added a single word beneath a line. Breathe. ADPT for deaf character. Dandara's internal lines are shown through on-screen captions and close-up gestures. Production to choose sign method and caption style. She remains deaf. No hearing restoration implied. Word of her rehearsals spread. Some watched out of curiosity, some with amusement, and Christina with appetite for calamity. Christina's face had settled into a mask of righteous expectation, the belief that each of the mansion's little rebellions would end predictably in someone's humiliation. She collected gossip like coins. She whispered to anyone who would listen that Dandara wore the wrong kind of courage, too public, too tender. The whisper traced its way into the corners where the house stored its cruelties. Dona Gloria moved the opposite way, quietly protective, the veteran of many household storms. She mended Dandara's practice shoes with a thread that never showed. She altered the hem of the dress so that it would not snag on the ballroom's protruding floorboards. When she sewed, her needles moved like a metronome that had learned to keep patience. Donna Helena attended to arrangements that required more than needlework. She spoke on the phone in clipped phrases and arranged the seating chart as if it were a small treaty. She placed Henrique's name on the invitation in a way that allowed him to be both seen and dignified. She did not force him. She made it easy enough for him to consent and hard enough for him to withdraw without public excuse. Her diplomacy was a layered thing. It softened edges but also made certain doors impossible to close. Henrique watched the preparations like a man reading through a long list. He was not idle in his observations. He catalogued every rehearsal, every seam, every misstep, and tucked them away like evidence. He believed he had reasons to be strict. The world had become brittle and, in his telling, dangerous. Control had become his currency. Still, he found his gaze returning to the ballroom more than it returned anywhere else. There was a stubbornness in him that did not want to be moved by beauty. Beauty, he believed, had betrayed him. Occasionally, in a voice that was more rust than thunder, he attempted to insert himself into her preparation. He sent for a sheet of music and asked someone to read it aloud as he followed the notation with a finger on the paper, eyes narrowed. He tried, clumsy and precise at once, to teach her an old, measured posture he remembered from dances long ago. The lessons were awkward. He could not stand, but he demonstrated the shift of weight with a practiced motion of his shoulder, the tilt of a chin, the placement of a hand. He modeled an old economy of movement, a grammar of gestures that had once been part of his life. In private, the lessons took on a different tone. Henrique, who rarely let others see him diminished, watched the way Dandara listened with her body. He would demonstrate a step, slow and careful. She would mirror him. He would pause, watch the way the soles of her feet found purchase, and remember a step of his own. There were nights when he pressed his lips together to keep the sound that wanted to come from escaping. An awkward attempt at encouragement squeezed into a throat that had not had reason to show tenderness in a long time. They did not speak much. Their exchanges were mostly notes and gestures, short, economical, as if words were luxuries neither could afford. Sometimes he wrote a single sentence on a slate and pushed it across the small conference table reserved for household matters. "Hold the back a little more." She read it, nodded, and signed a shape he did not recognize and would later, in a moment when he tried to learn, repeat clumsily. The lessons became small bridges. Behind the scenes, not everything was orderly. Christina, feeling the pressure that attention on Dandara created, began to act like the house's minor saboteur. She spilled a cleaning solution near the dresses and blamed an inattentive footman. She left a roll of tape on the stage where Dandara might catch her hem. These acts were small, petty as all domestic cruelties are. They were designed to assert a hierarchy. The staff's gossip widened to a question. Would the woman from the margins, whose gestures the house had tolerated and who had been sustained by necessity, survive being made visible? Or would visibility break her? On the night of the benefit, the mansion transformed. Curtains opened in ways they never had for the staff. Candles and electric light combined to create a glow that made even the dust look like gold. Guests arrived in clothes that held stories. They moved through the rooms with practiced detachment. Waiters circulated with trays as if the clink of glass could erase difference. The ballroom was full in a way that felt like a public ritual. Dandara stood behind a folding screen for a long minute before she emerged. The dress fit enough to be an argument. Donna Gloria's small corrections to the hem showed in the way the fabric moved as she breathed. Dandara closed her eyes and placed her palm flat against the wall beside her to steady herself. She felt the faint vibration of a trumpet in the distance, the footfall of servers, the thrum of conversation. Each one entered her through the bones as if the city were conducting a distant orchestra. She allowed herself one small smile to be worn like armor. Heinrich watched from his reserved chair at the far end of the room. He had his program open but did not read it. He had consented to be present and to be recognized in the guest list. He had not consented to be seen as soft. He had dressed with the care of a man who believed an appearance could preempt pity. He was in a suit tailored to keep his shoulders in the shape of command. His eyes, though, followed the way the light hit her dress, caught on the curve of her wrist when she adjusted the hem. He felt, without admitting it, an itch of memory. Donna Helena introduced the program with a grace that made the evening look like it had always been inevitable. She stood and spoke a few sentences about community and the clinic and the unexpected talents that live on the margins. Her voice filled the room. When she turned to invite the performers, she did so with a look that included Dandara and excluded pity. It was an invitation framed as a fact. Talent was deserving of attention. Dandara walked to the center of the floor. The orchestra, small, elegant, playing chamber arrangements, began a measured piece. It would be enough for most, but the system that had to work that night failed in ways that were small and then large. A technician backstage tapped a microphone and found it dead. Light cues misfired. The program's carefully rehearsed rhythm began to fray like old lace. Christine had whispered once that things would go wrong. She may have nudged a loose cable. She may have simply been a party to smaller acts of mischief whose source could not be proved. There are people who keep inventories of other people's possible failures. Christina kept hers like a ledger. The orchestra faltered as their conductor signaled confusion. A murmur rose, polite and then nervous. Dandara felt it as a physical shift, as if the air had changed its density. In the silence that followed, 100 eyes found her like sun seeking a single shard of glass. She had rehearsed with music. She had rehearsed barefoot with the hum of city bass under the boards. But the absence of sound required a different courage. She took a breath and then began. She started with her hands. Her palms slapped the floor twice, and the sound that followed was not the room's intended music, but a new rhythm, raw and human. The clap created a percussion that the floor accepted readily. It returned to her a vibration that she could feel under her soles. She tapped a rhythm on the frame of a nearby bench, then on the side of a chair. And the guests turned and, at first out of confusion, then out of a rising curiosity, began to clap along. The clapping multiplied like a small contagion. It found the old men in the second row who used to clap for an orchestra, and the younger men at the edges who had been bored. It found the house staff in the wings who had been waiting for a spectacle. The sound design of that moment was more than a technical failure mended by improvisation. It was a communal decision to make noise together so the silence would not defeat them. The rhythm, simple and insistent, moved like a tide, carried by bodies whose hands found each other reluctantly at first and then with greater confidence. Dandara's feet counted the beats. Her hips spoke in accents she had taught herself in the empty ballroom. She used her shoulders like punctuation marks and her neck to map a line of memory. She created an architecture of movement that did not require an orchestra, to be honest. The camera of the night would have lingered on hands. Dandara's, Henrique's, the audience's. Each one a parable. Close-ups of palms meeting wood, of fingers finding braille-like textures on the floor, of a bridesmaid's rings catching light. The rhythm built and the room rose into a sound that was greater than its parts. Even those who had come to be amused found themselves listening with another kind of attention. They felt the beat in their bodies. Henrique watched as the clapping grew like a soft revolution. He had intended to observe, to be both judge and spectator. He had not intended to be part of anything. Then, In a sequence that felt at once accidental and significant, Dandara moved her focus from the room to him. She stepped toward his reserved space, mindful of the furniture and the formality. She reached out, not dramatic but direct, and placed her hand on the polished wood of his armrest. The motion was a simple act of translation, an offering of her rhythm, a request to be included. For a breath, he did not react. His hands had been kept close to the support for so long that the idea of contact felt like an intrusion. The house watched, collectively holding out its breath. The cameras would later call it a moment of miracle. The truth was quieter. It was the meeting of two people who had, each for their own reasons, been starved of contact. Dandara lifted her fingers a little and touched the back of his hand, a place where skin told stories of temperature and agility. She placed her palm against his and squeezed, rhythmically, once, twice, 3 times in the same pattern she had been giving the floor. She offered him a beat. She did not ask for anything else. The gesture was both an invitation and an assertion. I include you. Be included. Henrique felt the touch as if it were a new language pressed against his skin. It arrived at the edge of memory, the pressure of a child's hand years ago, the way his wife's fingers might have settled once against his. It pulled a shape of feeling across his ribs that had been dulled by sorrow and fury. For a second, the old defenses stood ready. He had practiced a lifetime of control. Being touched without permission was an offense he had learned to repel. Yet in that small, stubborn squeeze, something shifted. He allowed his hand to relax. The muscles in his forearm, unused to being given over to the negotiation of tenderness, contracted once and then, with a tremulous truth, softened. He turned his hand so that his fingers lay atop Dandara's. He did not move his arm. He merely permitted contact. When he did, the sound around them folded into a single note and then into a swell. The audience, some because they had been moved by the improvisation, some because their inners had been unexpectedly touched, rose as if from one impulse. A standing ovation was less about perfection and more about recognition. They recognized that 2 small people had reached across a gulf. His face moved through a handful of expressions: shock, resistance, the first soft uncoiling of grief. Tears, slow, stubborn, came down in a way that was shameful to him and then astonishingly honest. The public wept with him, or for him, or alongside him. It did not matter which. The important fact was that the house had not been able to keep that moment neat. The machinery of cruelty that had been in place for years, small humiliations, policies of exclusion, could not contain the intimacy of a touch. After the applause, while the crowd buzzed in a new kind of energy, Henrique cleared his throat as if to say something that had been rehearsed for other occasions. His voice came out thin but steady. He rose a fraction, having discovered that he could, for a moment, allow his chest to show. He spoke with the economy of a man who had relearned public vulnerability as a duty. He apologized, not a theatrical apology, but a specific, awkward accounting. To the house, to Dandara, to himself. He named that he had been cruel, and because it is more difficult to hear a public confession than to give it, his words carried weight. He promised, imperfectly, to do better. He announced funding for the clinic the benefit had intended to support, and then paused, searching for the rest. He introduced a new line in his speech that no program had prepared for. He declared the creation of a small scholarship and a training fund for children who had talent but no access, a long-term program to be managed by the clinic, and, he added with a voice that found its own new edges, a partner he would commission to help run it. It was not a flourish. It was a structural change, a commitment to something that could outlast a night. When he said Dandara's name, spoken by the house as if it had always been part of the list of things worth hearing, she felt the space open beneath her feet like a tide returning. After that night, things did not become tidy. There was no overnight cure for the parts he had been taught to protect with his cruelty. But the world shifted under the pressure of something honest. Henrique began to keep appointments that were not about empire, but about repair. He hired a physiotherapist and began, in private sessions, to perform exercises that were small victories. A lift of the pelvis when he leaned into the support, a few seconds standing with assistance, a shaky first attempt at bearing weight while hands steadied him. Each was recorded, not as evidence of miraculous recovery, but as testimony to the slow work of rebuilding. Roberto, the driver, whose guilt had been a quiet companion for years, did something wrong one night and then did something right the next. He had once withheld a letter. Now he delivered a small envelope to Dandara containing a note and a few bills. He stood back when she read it, shoulders heavy. Later, when questioned, he admitted to having slipped in a cable the night of the benefit, an act he had intended as a small sabotage to protect his job after a bet with Christina, and then confessed he had regretted it immediately. He apologized privately to Dandara, who listened and signed a brief acceptance. He repented by helping with the Institute's early logistics, driving children to auditions, arranging supplies. His contrition was practical, sustained by work. Christina's appetite for other people's collapses cooled under the new social climate. Some part of her could not stomach the idea of her own vindication dissolving into public generosity. She watched the house change and felt abandoned by her own old comforts. In time, she left, under a cloud of whispered reasons, and the house took her absence as a faint relief more than a moral victory. Donna Gloria remained, her small kindnesses turned into the mortar of a more humane household. Dandara's life unfolded with the blunt facts of reality. She did not become a professional dancer overnight. She was given opportunities, scholarships, training hours, a mentor from the city's academy, and she used them with a stubborn, methodical dedication. She learned new techniques, the discipline of rehearsal under criticism that was honest and kind. She still practiced barefoot in the same way she had in the ballroom, the vibration of the floor guiding her body. She also learned to read compositions, to map choreography onto the architecture of space, to teach movement to others who had never been taught it was possible. Adaptation for deaf character. In scenes where Dandara instructs hearing children or speaks to hearing staff, show her using a combination of sign, tactile cues, demonstration, and written notes. On-screen captions for her key instructional sentences may be used. Do not suggest she gains hearing. Henrique's transformation did not become a testimony written into his bones all at once. He continued to be brusque when his walls felt threatened. He still had moments when he considered the control he had lost and thought angrily about what the world had taken. But the crack made by the public touch was not a flaw to be exploited. It was a point of honest vulnerability that opened options. He began to invest in longer-term projects. The clinic fund became a more ambitious initiative that would, over months and then years, include scholarships for dance, physical therapy grants, and a program for working-class youth to access arts education. The institute that eventually bore Dandara's name began as a modest classroom with donated space, and grew into a small building where movement was taught not as entertainment, but as a language of dignity. Henrique's funding paid for floors that would translate bass into vibration for deaf students, for equipment that allowed students to feel rhythm through platform resonators, and for teachers who were trained to engage across differences. The teaching emphasized craft, precision, discipline, the joy that comes from technically earned achievement. Dandara, as a director, insisted on both excellence and accessibility. She refused to allow pity to do the work of education. Her school taught technique and self-respect in equal measure. Months later, at the Institute's modest opening, Henrique arrived in a manner that was, for him, the measure of a long route traveled. He asked for a small ramp rather than a platform. He took the podium with an awkward steadiness and spoke about accountability. He told the crowd, simply, that a hand had changed him, but then corrected himself. It was not only a hand, it was being seen without being judged, being taught without being patronized. He committed funds to ongoing scholarships and pledged to keep the institute independent through an endowment. He made no grand promises about his own body, only blunt, truthful acknowledgments of the slow work he was undertaking. Dandara stood beside him, not as a prize, but as a partner. She watched him with a steady look, fingers ready to sign if necessary, but content to let him say what he needed to say. The cameras hungrily sought the image of the billionaire and the maid-turned-leader. The truth, quieter, was that both had earned something the cameras could not capture, a shared sense of responsibility. Henrique had been taught, in public, that his wealth could be used to make a difference if he accepted both credit and blame. Dandara had been taught that talent could be amplified by resources, not swallowed by charity. The Institute's early days were messy, full of funding disputes, scheduling chaos, and pedagogical disagreements. They were, however, sustained by work. Kids arrived with scraped knees and bright eyes. Some were deaf like Dandara, others had never sat in a class that invited their bodies to be more than tools of labor. They learned to find rhythm in different ways, through vibration plates, through visual cues, through counting that made the body a ledger of beats. Dandara insisted on lessons that included body literacy, how to sense your own core, how to find balance, how to express anger without harm and joy with clarity. Henrique visited often. At first, he watched from a small chair in the back, and later, under the careful supervision of therapists, he attempted to stand for longer minutes with supports. A therapist would position an adjustable chair behind his legs, and he would brace against bars while the children performed a small choreographed number. The movement reminded him of earlier lessons, until his muscles, long unused to such tasks, began to answer with new allegiance. There were days of progress and days of regression. He learned to celebrate the small measures, an extra 2 seconds of bearing weight, a less shaky transfer from one chair to another. He did not perform miracles, he performed persistence. The community responded. Local papers wrote not about redemption as a sudden transformation, but about the Institute's impact on children who had never been taught to imagine themselves as performers. Parents came with careful hope. The photographs the press used were honest, calloused hands, smiling teenagers, a director whose fingernails bore the marks of hard rehearsal. The Institute's name, simple after those who had fought hard to survive, began to mean a place where movement was both craft and empathy. Over time, Henrique restructured some of the mansion rules. He insisted that staff be permitted to take days to attend exams or medical appointments. He removed some of the humiliating rituals he had once tolerated as house discipline. He did not convert overnight from authoritarian to saint. He simply made practical changes, staffed by people who were paid fairly and who had access to resources. Transparency became part of the mansion's governance. Dandara's public life changed, but she retained a stubborn privacy. The cameras visited, and she did interviews that she prepped for like a performance. What she would sign, what she would write, what she would let the world see. She refused to be their story in full. She taught, she ran rehearsals, she drove wayward teenagers to auditions. She still kept the photograph of her mother in a frame on her dresser. The mother's cough improved slightly with continued treatment. Bills still arrived. Caring for a family did not end because a handshake had been witnessed. Years later, there was a scene that would be quietly rehearsed into the memory of the community, the opening of a new wing at the Institute. Children who had once been timid took stage with the confidence that comes from being taught your body can hold an idea. Dandara moved among them, touching shoulders, adjusting shoulders, offering a thumb to a nervous child's wrist, a practice she had developed to translate tempo into touch. Henrique, now accustomed to being seen as both benefactor and student, waited in the audience. During the opening, Dandara tapped out a rhythm that was understood by everyone present. It was the code she had used the first night the sound failed. The children clapped and stamped as part of their choreography, translating music into a communal heartbeat. Henrique watched and smiled in a way that had the rough edges of a man who had earned softness rather than been given it. When the dance ended, he rose, not because cameras demanded it, but because he had learned to stand for others. He walked forward with the support of 2 assistants and a gait that was still unsteady but increasingly intentional. With their help, he was steadied and made present. Dandara approached him. The room quieted in that pause, not out of reverence, but out of recognition. The 2 who had begun as opposites had formed a practical, mutual project. She extended her hand and placed it over his, and he closed his fingers around hers. The hand that had reached out on a night of improvised rhythm had led to a partnership of action. They did not need to speak the story aloud for the room to understand. In the months that followed, the Institute grew in modest, sustainable ways. Scholarships were maintained. The clinic received regular contributions. Henrique continued therapy. Dandara continued to teach. Children learned to reframe what dancing could mean for them, a tool for confidence, a profession, or simply a way to exist in a body with joy. When the cameras returned for a retrospective, the story was more complicated and truer than the neat headline. Reporters were interested in the image of a billionaire softened by a maid's touch. What they found was a landscape of slow repairs. They found administrators who met weekly to ensure transparency. They found a woman who had not changed her name, but had changed the map of opportunity. They found a man who, in public and in private, worked at being less harsh. They found a community that had been invited to participate in someone else's recovery and had, in doing so, found avenues to heal itself. Years later, in a quiet scene free of cameras, Henrique and Dandara walked through a rehearsal at the Institute. The children practiced across a polished floor that transmitted bass through special plates. Some of them were deaf, some hearing. Dandara moved through the class like a conductor, her hands shaping movement the way a gardener shapes a tree. Henrique sat in a chair at the side of the room without pretense. A therapist guided him through a balance exercise he could now perform for 10 seconds unassisted. 10 after hundreds of attempts. Each second was a measured triumph. At the end of the session, a child came forward shyly and offered a folded paper. It contained a drawing, 2 hands touching, surrounded by little rays of light, and beneath the drawing a note in childish handwriting. "You saved me." The child had not meant the sentence to be literal in the way a courtroom would parse it. The child meant it in the practical way children mean such things. "You helped me see a new path." Henrique took the paper as if it were a document of consequence. He read it slowly and then looked up at Dandara, who had signed something too quick for the room to catch, but clear enough for their shared life. He smiled in a way that was not about his image, but about being recognized for work that mattered. Their lives were not neat. There were still nights when Henrique retreated into old habits of control. There were days when Dandara's mother needed care and money was tight. There were administrative fights and petty staff complaints. There were also countless small acts. A child taught to feel a beat in her ribs. A man who could finally stand for a few more seconds each month. A staff meeting where wages were set fairly. A performance where a group of children from poor neighborhoods danced with the same assurance as conservatory students. One afternoon, years after the first touch, Henrique sat alone in the old room where the photograph of his laughter had been kept. He took the photo from its place and turned it over. On the back, someone had written in an unmistakable hand a familiar phrase, "Wear this with your head up." He smiled at the echo and placed the photograph back on the table. Then he reached for a slate and wrote slowly, "Thank you." He left the note on the kitchen table, where Dandara found it later. She signed in return and left a small scrap of paper with a line that might have been a joke or might have been a prayer. "Keep dancing." In the end, the thing that changed the mansion was not a single theatrically staged conversion or a miraculous cure. It was the accumulation of small, accountable choices. It was the willingness of one person to touch another without claiming ownership. It was the willingness of a wealthy man to fund a structure that required stewardship. It was the insistence of a teacher who would not let pity do the work of education. It was a community learning to construct possibility instead of rehearsing humiliation. On a bright morning, the Institute opened a classroom that looked out onto a playground where children danced in pairs. Dandara watched them from the doorway, hands clasped behind her back. Henrique watched from a bench a little way off, a therapist by his side, and the careful evidence of progress in the way he balanced himself. A child ran up and threw flowers at their feet like a spontaneous blessing. They smiled, and for a long second, the image, those two hands meeting once again, circulated between them like a private pact. They had each been changed by a hand. Neither had claimed that the touch alone had fixed everything. It had not. But the reach across that first night had broken something that had imprisoned them. The belief that dignity could be dispensed and not earned. The idea that people were either to be dominated or pitied. Instead, they had rearranged possibility into practice. Years later, when asked what began it all, Dandara would say, in signs and in carefully chosen, captioned words, that she had approached a man who had forgotten how to be seen and had simply touched his hand. She would say the rest was work. Henrique would say, in public and with less theatricality than the headlines preferred, that he had been offered a beat and he had decided, finally, to learn the rhythm. Share one small moment that changed you in the comments. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that a single, brave touch can begin a long, honest repair.